Hi, Modern World History students. This is Ed Puzzle number 4, and in Unit 1, we've moved on to the third big question, which is who is in charge of our society? And we're actually continuing Section 8. We will have started Section 8 in class, and we're continuing it. So this Ed Puzzle is a continuation of that, and therefore it's a continuation of the question, why were medieval kings less powerful than we usually imagine, especially in England? And so in class, we'll have actually covered really most of the terms in this section, leaving only this last one, Magna Carta, to really cover. So just kind of setting you up for that so you understand what we're doing here. Magna Carta is a really, really famous and excellent example of how medieval kings really were not as powerful as we might imagine, especially in England, because Magna Carta applied really just to the King of England. So let's start on page 18 up at the top with a little bit of a review. So remember that in medieval Europe, kings really had no way to protect their kingdom other than by trading a portion of the land in the kingdom to a group of people who promised to be loyal and who promised to provide military service to the king. And that group of people were called the nobles or the knights. And the knights were these armored horseback warriors, and the nobles were sort of their commanders. And together they formed the basis of the king's army um, in order to defend the kingdom and the king against things like Viking raids, right? What really necessitated all this was the terror of the Vikings. And the reason why the kings in medieval society had to rely on trading away portions of their land in exchange for this promise of protection and loyalty was that the medieval kings had not developed any really efficient way of collecting taxes. The ancient Romans had an effective way of collecting taxes, but after the fall of the authority of the Roman Empire, all of that infrastructure and system that they'd created fell apart. So medieval kings didn't have that, and that's why they had to rely on what was called the feudal system, in which they traded away the land and the labor of the people living on the land to these nobles and knights in exchange for the promise by the nobles and knights that they would protect the king and his kingdom and that they would be loyal. But it was really more than that. Kings relied on their nobles for more than just protection. They relied on their nobles for basically administering the kingdom and doing the day to day work of government. I mean, you think about it, government does a lot. Government does a lot of things that we sort of take for granted. So, for example, building and repairing and maintaining roads, inspecting and repairing bridges, things like that, delivering the mail. There's a lot of things that government does that we sort of don't think about because they're always there, and we only think about it when they're not there. When something fails, we're like, oh, the government ought to do something about this road. Look at all the potholes or whatever, right? Um, well, the because the king did not have a way of collecting taxes, all these things cost money. Because the king did not have a way of collecting taxes, not only did he not have a way of hiring an army to protect his kingdom, he also had no way of hiring all those government employees, right, to do all these other things like inspecting roads and bridges and making repairs and carrying the mail and all that. So he also relied on his nobles to do that. So he relied on the nobles to protect him and his kingdom. He also relied on them just to do the basic day to day work of governing the kingdom. And also think about things like apprehending and punishing criminals. So if he didn't have tax money to form an army, and if he didn't have tax money to hire government officials to inspect the roads and do stuff like that, he also didn't have tax money to hire a police force and have a system of courts and jail, things like that. So he relied on the nobles for the administration of justice also. So kings, when you think about it, protecting the kingdom and your subjects, day-to-day job of governing the country, apprehending and punishing criminals. We pretty much named all the functions of government. I mean, all the major functions of government there. And because the kings in medieval times had no efficient way to collect taxes, they had to rely on their nobles to do all of this. So the nobles to whom they had traded land, in exchange for that land, the kings expected and needed the nobles to defend the kingdom, administer the kingdom, the day-to-day business of governing, and administration of justice. So they were basically entirely reliant on their nobles for all the functions of government. So that's why we say that in medieval Europe, kings were cash poor, right? They were land rich, they owned the land in the kingdom, cash poor. So instead of using cash to hire people to do their work, they exchanged land. In exchange, they got this work done for them by the nobles. But what that really meant was that the kings were also not very powerful. The real truth is that instead of all the power in the kingdom being kind of concentrated in the king, all that power was really decentralized or fragmented or broken up, because that power was in the hands of all these nobles. The real power over the kingdom, governing the kingdom, was in the hands of the nobles, not of the king. The king was utterly reliant, utterly dependent on his nobles to basically do all the work of governing the kingdom. And, I've got a chessboard here. And if you know a little tiny bit about chess, chess is an ancient game. It's been around for over 1,000 years. And when chess and the rules of chess were developed, it was meant to be a kind of a reflection of society at that time and of government at that time. And so if you know a little bit about the game, the pawns, sort of representing the peasants or serfs, they're the weakest characters on the board. They can only move one space at a time, except for on their first move when they can move two. Yeah, I know. But generally, they can only move one space at a time, only forward, except on a kill. They move diagonally. Again, I get it. The point is, they are the most limited. Of all the pieces on the board, they're the least powerful. Their movement is the most limited. But the second most limited chess piece is the king, right? It's the king who can move any direction he wants, but he can only move one space at a time. Well, all the other characters, they can move multiple directions, they can move unlimited number of spaces. The horse, the knight can do that little L-shaped move. So all the other chess pieces, other than the pawns, are much more mobile, therefore much more powerful than the king. And that was meant to be a reflection of how things really were at the time. The king had to be protected, right? That's the whole point of the game of chess, protect your king. The king had to be protected, but the king himself was not powerful. And the game of chess was invented as a kind of a reflection of that, maybe even a little bit of a satire, a parody of that. So this is the thing. You have to think about how medieval kings were not rich and they weren't powerful. Our whole image of what a king is and what a king's supposed to be is more of a modern image, and we'll get to that. It's more of a modern image of what a king is, but medieval kings were neither rich nor powerful, utterly dependent on their nobles. And the problem with that was that what happens when the nobles eventually figure out that the king needs them a lot more than they need the king? And this happened in almost every feudal society, wherever the feudal system existed. You almost always come to a point where the nobles figure this out, that the king needs them a lot more than they need him. And what happens oftentimes is they rebel against the king. Well, if this is true, why do we continue to serve the king? Why don't we run the kingdom instead? And something like that happened in England, and that gives rise to what was called Magna Carta. So I'm now moving down to the bottom of page 18. So if you're not familiar, England is a kingdom that is located on the island of Great Britain. All right. So if this is something you're not familiar with, definitely turn to the map on the back of your packet and label these. So Great Britain is the name of an island. It's this entire island here that the that the rectangle surrounds. This one over here that's not fully in the rectangle, that's Ireland over there. But this island here, fully surrounded by the rectangle, that is the island of Great Britain. There are three kingdoms on that island. One kingdom is called Scotland. It's up here in the north. One kingdom is called Wales. It's over here in the west. But the one that we're focused on is the largest, most populated, and most powerful kingdom on this island, and that's called England. So England is located here in the southern part. Did I say Scotland was in the south? No, I don't think. Scotland's in the north, Wales here. The biggest and most powerful kingdom on the island of Great Britain was England, and it was located in the south and in the east here. So right here, that's where you label England. So if you're not familiar with that, make sure that you pause the video for a second, turn to that last page of the packet, and label these on your map. All right, so in the year 1215, the King of England was named John, just King John, and you see him here seated. And John was at war. John and England were at war. They were at war with France. And this was not a war that John had started. It was a war that he had inherited. England and France had already been at war for several years, almost for 150 years, off and on, by the time John became king. And there's a whole story about that. It starts when a conqueror named William, the Duke of Normandy, Normandy is part of France today. He had invaded and conquered England, made himself King of England. And he then used his base in Normandy, which is part of France, to try to expand his territory into France. So England and France were always kind of at war with each other. France trying to prevent the King of England from expanding by taking over their territory. England always trying to prevent France from taking over their territory. And so by the time that John became King of England, England had been at war with France off and on for almost 150 years. Well, John was determined to win the war. And he knew that in order to win the war, he would have to defeat France's armies in France. So what he had done is he had deployed the armies of England into France to try to basically win decisive victories and bring an end to the war and to defeat France's armies there on their home turf. Well, that took months because, as you noticed, England is an island, or England is located on an island, and therefore the armies of England that were fighting in France had to be supplied by ship, and they're far away from home, and that's just difficult. It's difficult. And so the war against France was dragging on and on. And what that meant was that John's knights and his nobles had been deployed for many, many months in France fighting this war. And that's not technically what they'd signed up for. The feudal contracts, remember, required the nobles and the knights to provide military service to the king. But generally speaking, the number of weeks out of a year that the nobles and knights were required to provide this service was pretty limited, usually 6 or 7 weeks. 6 or 7 weeks of military service per year is what the nobles and knights were on the hook for in exchange for the use of the fief, that portion of land that the king provided to them. And the reason why it was such a short term was, remember, the feudal contracts were originally written to protect the king and his kingdom against Viking raids. And remember, the Vikings didn't stay. They knew that if they stayed, you would build up a big army and vastly outnumber them and defeat them. So remember, the Vikings, when they raided, they were in and out, right? And so when these feudal contracts were created, it made sense to only require your nobles and knights to provide service 6 or 7 weeks out of the year. But in a war like this war against the French, where you're in it for the long haul, you're trying to defeat France's armies on their home turf, it's not going to be done in 6 or 7 weeks. And it wasn't. This war was dragging on and on. And the nobles and knights were deployed in France for months, not weeks, months. And in the meantime, they missed their homes, they missed their families. And remember, the whole point of them having the land that the king had provided to them was so that they could make money, so that they had the command. They controlled not only the land, but they controlled the labor of the serfs who lived on the land. Well, they didn't know while they were gone. Were the serfs continuing to do the work that they were supposed to do? Were they still raising the crops that would allow them to make the money to feed their own families and to make themselves rich? They didn't know. It was a real concern that they were gone for as long as they were. And so the nobles and the knights presented to John their concern, their complaints, and he ignored them. He completely ignored them. And so they rebelled. John's nobles and knights, England's army, rebelled against the king and said, well, then we're not going to fight. We refuse, right? You have kept us in France much longer than we're required to be by our contracts, and we're going to refuse to fight for you. So John tried to punish the nobles and knights. He seized their property. He took their property and said, well, then you don't own this anymore. I'm going to take it. And he didn't just take back the land, but things like storehouses full of grain. He seized the grain which they'd been storing up. He put some of them in jail, put some of their families in jail. So he took away their property, he took away their freedom, their liberty by putting them in jail, and just in general, basically punished them despite the fact that they really hadn't done anything wrong, right? They hadn't committed any crimes. These nobles and knights had simply refused to fight because the contract that they had, the feudal contract, only required them to fight 6 or 7 weeks out of the year, right? So they had broken no laws. By refusing to fight, they had broken no laws. They hadn't even broken their contract. They had fulfilled the terms of the contract. It was the king who was sort of breaking the contract by keeping them deployed on the battlefield longer than they were supposed to be. The king was really in the wrong here, and yet he was administering punishments. And so the nobles and knights now took their rebellion to the next level. Much more than simply refusing to fight, now they waged an armed uprising against King John himself, right? So they rebelled violently against King John, and they captured him. And when they captured King John, of course, what was he going to do? Usually when there's a rebellion, you call out the army to defeat the rebellion. What do you do when the army's the ones who are rebelling? Well, John, he had no options. So he handed himself over as a prisoner, and the nobles presented to him a list of demands. And this list of demands was called the Charter of the Nobles, or the Charter of the Barons. Barons is a fancy name for nobles. But it eventually became known as the Great Charter. And that's what Magna Carta means. Magna Carta, the Great Charter. And what it was basically a list of demands. The nobles were demanding that King John accept certain limits on his power. And that's what Magna Carta does. It places strict limits on the power of the king. So not surprisingly, one of the limits says the king is not allowed to deny any knight or noble. The king is not allowed to deny any of the nobles their property or their liberty without some sort of fair trial. You've got to have a trial, and you've got to prove that someone has broken the law before you punish them by denying them their liberty or their property. So this strictly limited the king, said the king cannot take away a noble's liberty or property unless there's been sort of fair trial that's proven that they've broken the law. Another limit said the king cannot raise taxes on the nobles without having their permission. If the king ever wanted to raise taxes on the nobles, he had to assemble all the nobles together in what was called the Grand Council. And then the king would present to the nobles the reasons why he needed increased taxes. He would explain to the nobles what benefits he would provide to them in exchange for the increased taxes. Like a bigger navy to protect against pirates or Vikings or whatever. He had to justify the reason for the raised taxes. He had to tell the barons, here's what you're going to get out of it. He had to tell the nobles, here's what you'll get out of it. And then they would vote. And only if they voted in favor of the taxes could the king raise the taxes. And that council eventually developed into what is today England's parliament. We'll get into that in a later lesson. The Magna Carta also said that even the king has to obey the law. The king is not above the law. Even the king has to obey the law. The king can't just do whatever he wants. Right? The king has to obey the laws. And there were many others, but we're going to focus just on those three. The king cannot deny a noble his liberty or his property without some sort of fair trial that proves that that noble has broken a law, committed a crime. The king cannot tax the nobles without their consent given by the Grand Council. And the king cannot violate the law. The king is not above the law. The king has to obey the laws, just like everybody else. So every one of those represented a limitation on the king's power. And that's in the end what Magna Carta was all about. It was a list of ways that the king's power was limited. Now think about that for a second. We've gone from the God King, who claims to be a God on earth and whose power is therefore limitless. You must do what the king commands you to do because the king is a god. We've gone from that to, well, maybe the king's not a god, but the king was chosen by God, so you still need to do whatever he tells you to do. And now to King John, who's basically being pushed around by his nobles. He is so dependent on them for everything, for every component of governing his kingdom, that they can push him around and tell him, no, 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 you're not allowed to do this. You're not allowed to do this. These are the limits that we demand on your power. And if you don't sign this, we're going to kill you. So this is a far cry. And this represented, it really goes to show you just how dependent that the kings of medieval Europe were, and really how powerless they were. And on the other hand, how much more powerful the nobles were. Magna Carta is the best example of that. So here's the thing. Obviously, somewhere along the line, in the years after this, kings became more powerful. Because whereas modern kings were relatively poor and basically powerless, whereas medieval kings were relatively poor and basically powerless compared to their nobles, modern kings are not. Modern kings are wealthy and powerful. So in future lessons here, we'll teach you how that transition happened as we shift from the medieval world into the modern world. So we'll teach you those lessons soon. I'll look forward to it. But until then, take care of yourselves, hang in there, be healthy and safe. Bye-bye, Modern World History students.